and their guests ask and answer some difficult questions facing our nation. Among them, how do we make popular gun control a reality in America? Thoughts and prayers aren't enough, and even though polling confirms we agree on much more than not, when it comes to assault weapons and universal background checks, nothing meaningful gets passed in Washington. We think there's a bill that could change that. Today we'll discuss. Jordan Neely. He's the name of the man who was killed by a chokehold in a New York City subway. We look at this story from several angles, including how the mentally ill and homeless are all but invisible to many, and how stories like this get exploited by the media on both sides. On the legal front, we consider the road ahead for Donald Trump, as his problems inside of courtrooms are only beginning, even after guilty verdicts in New York City. In fact, that's where I'd like to begin our program. While a jury in near record time this week returned guilty verdicts against Donald Trump relating to him sexually assaulting Jean Carroll in 1996, it was the judge's advice to the civil jury that caught my ear. After thanking them for their service, Judge Kaplan suggested to the men and women that they may not want to publicly identify themselves, quote, not now and not for a long time, end quote. His reasoning was sound. Trump's penchant of directing violence and threats against basic democratic norms is now a basic given. Think about that. A one-time and possibly future president can't be trusted not to target jurors who simply performed a critical role in any functioning democracy. Now, it's like I'm talking about some two-bit gangster Don, not someone to be entrusted with nuclear launch codes. This is certifiably insane, but that's where we are. A jury of his peers found him liable for sexual assault. Other courts, they're likely about to try him for fraud, attempting to steal an election, as well as his overarching role in leading a seditious mob on our country on January 6th. Everyone knows he's twice impeached, incapable of telling the truth, and has said and done things we'd be humiliated if a family member did the same. And yet, as I sit here today, most Republicans want him to be their voice again. There's something so wrong with this picture, it's almost like it's impossible to know where we should start. And I think that's part of the problem. Now, we're going to talk much more about this and other court cases confronting Trump a little bit later in the program. But to kick off our show, here's Thom Hartmann on if gun control can ever become a reality in America.
From HartmannReport.com. It's titled, "We Already Have the Law to Get Weapons of War Off Our Streets. We've done it before." And, I started out talking about this most recent mass shooting, Stephen Spainhour, going to the mall to see his son, and in the parking lot as he's heading into the mall, he comes across a little 5-year-old girl slumped over a bush. He tries to turn her over to see if she needs CPR, and her face is missing. Then he goes a little farther, and there's a dead woman laying on top of a child. He moves the woman, and the child runs. It turns out he's alive, and he says, "My mommy's hurt. My mommy's hurt." And so the Mr. Spainhour tries to take care of this little boy. He's former military, former law enforcement, so he knows CPR. And he was on TV this morning. He's saying, we just need to do something about this. We need to get these weapons of war off our streets. And I completely agree. We need to get these weapons of war off our streets. So how do we do it? All of the Texas Republicans, by the way, not a single one, when they referenced this shooting on Friday, not a single one, or on Saturday, not a single one used the word gun. Keith Self, who is the congressman who represents Allen, Texas, in the U.S. House of Representatives, said, "Our prayers are with the victims and their families." Right. Greg Abbott said, "Our hearts are with the people of Allen, Texas tonight during this unspeakable tragedy." It's unspeakable because you're not going to speak about guns, right? Republican Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick says, "Please join me in mourning the victims of this unspeakable tragedy." Republican Senator John Cornyn, "I am grieving with the Allen community tonight." These guys are behaving like this is a natural disaster, right? It's like, a tornado came through. Is there anything we can do about tornadoes? Well, no. So we just, thoughts and prayers. Ted Cruz. Heidi and I are praying for the families of the victims of this horrific mall shooting in Allen, Texas. We also pray for the broader Collin County community. Right. And, of course, indicted bribe taker and fraudster Republican Attorney General Ken Paxton says, pray for Allen, Texas. Pray for these families and law enforcement. Ricky Davila tweeted a list of Republicans and how much money they'd taken from the NRA, along with a note that said, I won't say the whole word, but you know what I'm talking about. F their thoughts and prayers. I'm with it. I'm with him in that. But it turns out that this slaughter isn't new or unique in American history. We went through a period like this before, and it was during the tail end of the Roaring '20s and the early years of the Great Depression, the late 1920s and the early 1930s. We still remember the names of the people who were involved in these, murder, robbery, mass shootings. Bonnie and Clyde gunned down civilians and cops with a full auto .30-06 from their M1918 Browning automatic rifles. Machine Gun Kelly preferred the Thompson. So did John Dillinger, whose famous Tommy gun has now been recreated and you can buy online. Babyface Nelson liked to kill FBI agents with his fully automatic .45 pistol. Pretty Boy Floyd's famous weapon was an automatic Colt pistol. Ma Barker, who at 5'4" was too short to carry a rifle, also used an automatic handgun. Al Capone carried a .38 Smith & Wesson. But his entire gang carried the fully automatic weapons. So, collectively throughout the 1920s and 30s, these people that we all know their names of, and hundreds of others whose names we don't remember, just basically slaughtered their way across America using weapons and ammunition that were developed in the 1850s and 1860s for the Civil War, and then fine-tuned again in the 19-aughts and the 19-teens for World War I. And then in 1934, America said, enough. Congress passed, and President Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the National Firearms Act of 1934. Now, the National Firearms Act did not outlaw a single gun. All it said is if you want to possess a sawed-off shotgun, an automatic pistol, or a fully automatic rifle, you must first pay a tax. And the tax is only $200. The $200 was specified in the law in 1934, and it's still $200. But in order to be eligible to pay that tax, you must first get a federal firearms license. And to do that, you have to submit your photo, you have to submit your fingerprints, you have to go through a background check, and you have to go through an in-person interview with an ATF agent. And when that law was put into place, it became basically impossible to resell these weapons. Nobody, as people died, people who owned the weapons died, their families couldn't do anything with them. They would destroy them, they would turn them into the local police departments, because, they hadn't paid the tax and they didn't want to be busted for tax evasion. There were serious penalties for tax evasion. There still are. So, there were no gun buyback programs in the 30s, and yet we got all these guns off the streets. Nobody went door to door confiscating guns, but we got all these guns off the streets. Which brings me to my simple proposal. When enough ethical politicians, aka Democrats, hold office to pull it off, hopefully after the 2024 election, we should simply amend the National Firearms Act to include semi-automatic weapons. Semi-automatic weapons were designed and developed for the battlefield to kill more people more efficiently. Now, I realize there are some hunting rifles that are sort of low-capacity semi-automatic. We could exempt those. But by and large, I mean, if you're a hunter and you show up in the woods, and I know this from personal experience, I've never been a hunter, but when Louise and I lived in Vermont, we owned almost 400 acres, actually a little over 400 acres of land, 424 acres of land. And, it was posted, and we had hunters traipsing through all the time. And, I mean, everybody in Vermont, not everybody, a lot of people hunt. You show up with an AR-15 in the forest looking for deer, they will laugh you out of that woods. That's not even remotely sportsmanlike. Plus, it ruins the hide and the meat. There's no reason for, semi-automatic weapons for hunting. There's no reason for semi-automatic weapons for self-defense. If you want to have a gun for self-defense, which, by the way, is a dumb idea, it's more, if you have a gun in your home, it's more likely to be used against you or somebody in your home than against a bad guy. And there's no doubt on the statistics on that. But nonetheless, if you want to do that, your best bet is a small pistol. Something you can easily conceal, something you can easily grab hold of. Running around with a rifle is going to be a real challenge, or even a good size, 10 shot clip semi-automatic pistol. So I'm saying let's just amend that law. Now, there are people who say, oh no, we can't do that because we've got to have, semi-automatic weapons of war in order to take on a tyrannical government. They're simply wrong. The founders never said that. In fact, they said the opposite. The Constitution doesn't say that. It says the opposite. It says private militias are illegal. 48 of 50 states have constitutions or laws that specifically outlaw what the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters do. It is illegal in 48 out of 50 states, and in the 2 states where it's not illegal in their constitution, it is illegal in their laws. The only exception to that is Idaho right now, which has not yet passed this law, but it has been introduced to the Idaho legislature to allow militias to organize themselves, independent civilian militias. So that's not even a reasonable explanation for it. So let your member of Congress know.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you like this podcast and care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's other audio series, On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amberin Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. I hope you'll join me on my new audio podcast, Justice Matters. I'll be using my 30 years as a federal prosecutor and Army JAG to unpack, break down, and explain the legal issues of the day, particularly where the legal intersects with the political. Please look for Justice Matters with Glenn Kirshner wherever you generally get your podcasts.
Republicans say they won't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. But can honest, hard-working middle-class Americans really believe what these politicians say? Republicans said they wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade. Here's what Supreme Court Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett said during their Senate confirmation hearings.
Roe v. Wade is a precedent of the United States Supreme Court. A good judge will consider it as precedent of the United States Supreme Court.
Roe v. Wade. It's settled as a precedent of the Supreme Court.
Roe is not a super precedent, but that doesn't mean that Roe should be overruled.
Well, we saw how that turned out. They played us for fools. Tell your elected officials to keep their hands off of our Social Security and health care benefits. Fool me once. Let Majority Rule was responsible for this message. LetMajorityRule.org is a project of the Marvin Lucas Super PAC, which is responsible for and paid for this ad and is not affiliated with or authorized by any political campaign or candidate or candidates committee.
As a career wide receiver, I've been hit hard. But no training nor practice prepared us for the devastation of COVID-19. Thankfully, there is hope. Even with multiple vaccines available, we still have to work together until everyone is safe. We all win when we unite to prevent.
Welcome back. What does the death of Jordan Neely, the troubled homeless man who died by a chokehold in a New York City subway, say about America? Here's Rick Smith with more on that.
It's time for the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith.
Thanks so much for being here. Today on the big program, lots to get to, lots to talk about. Want to talk about this Time magazine article I came across today. It's one of these moments where a headline catches your attention and you go, that's how you write a headline. Yeah, it caught your attention, but it wasn't factually inaccurate. We saw some photos and the stories coming out of New York of the homeless guy who was choked to death, as passengers feared. We don't have all the details, and I don't know that we're going to anytime soon. But the headline was that grabbed my attention. Nobody cares about homeless people until they die, and I'm going, that is the right frame. And I would argue, I would have added to that, and even then, I doubt very few people really care, because we don't seem to be doing much about it. Now, they went into the story of this Jordan Neely, the guy who was killed. And, look, I mean, another story of someone whose life was broken. His mother was murdered by her boyfriend when he was 14, didn't finish school, got into some trouble, had some drug problems, just a life of one obstacle, one bit of chaos after another, and no stability. And again, one of these things of no family structure that, I wish everyone had, the kind of family structure that would be supportive. Unfortunately, this guy didn't. And this is where I come back to society has to play a role in this. They point out that it's been reported he was arrested some 42 times, mostly for nonsense. I mean, this is one of those things. Oh, he was arrested 42 times. He's got a rap sheet down the. Yeah, he got arrested for vagrancy, probably for loitering, for panhandling, just nonsense. And instead of having a system that said, hey, we're going to deal with this, we had a system that just kept pushing him around. For instance, evidently he hit an old lady. I guess it was in 2021. He was arrested again. He then had a judge said, hey, we're gonna put you into rehab, get you some help. Don't use drugs for 15 months and you'll be okay. Well, evidently he left the place after 2 weeks. A system that did not follow up. And as the article says, very few people cared about this guy until he was killed. And now politically it's become, which camp are you in? Are you in the red hats or the blue hats? You got the R or the D, or you're a conservative or a liberal. We've got our sides without actually talking about the issue itself. And as I said from the beginning, and this was my hot take gut reaction. People in desperate situations do desperate things. And if there's a lack of humane solutions, inhumane solutions will fill the void. And that's what we've seen here. We saw people who were afraid of this guy because he was acting erratically. He was causing a disruption. And the only people who would interact with him were going to do it in all of the wrong ways. The person who got behind him and started and choked him to death, I'm sure, as his lawyer says, he didn't mean to cause any harm. But he was put in that situation where that's the choice he made. And what it is, and this is what's frustrating to me. We have a system that now wants to deal with this individual thing without looking at the much bigger picture. I look at, to my point of, each side wanting their thing. Jesse Waters over at the Fox place. He tweeted out, white liberals sentenced Jordan Neely to death on the streets, and now they're using him as a talking point. Does this feed the outrage machine? Does this make people on the right, on the extreme, go, yeah, those white, it's their fault? It's crazy to me, especially when you look at the fact that people like Jesse Waters and his ilk have done great harm over the last 40, 50 years in destroying what little safety net, social safety net that could have helped this guy. You know, years ago, we used to, when I had more time, and I regret not being able to do this anymore, but when we used to do these Hungry and Homeless for the holiday events, where we'd live in a parking lot of a supermarket for 10 days, and a local trucking company would lend us a trailer, and we would fill up the trailer with food and give it to the food bank, and we'd raise money for the homeless shelter, and raise awareness of the issue, and talk about it in a way that we hoped would be constructive, and in a way that we hoped would help lead to solutions and not leave that void. Because again, you know, the lack of humane solutions leads to inhumane outcomes. And, you know, I remember going in with all of the same stereotypical views of people who are homeless. You know, mostly just people who made bad choices, drug addicts, lazy people, things like that. And what I came away with, and this is when you expose yourself to different ideas, different kinds of situations, different people, you come away with very different points of view. What I came away with is the vast majority of the people we met, they were struggling with mental health problems. Because what we used to do is during the day, we would be there and people would drop off food and we'd interact with the customers coming in and out of the supermarket, and we would, you know, do that stuff. But at night, when consumer traffic slowed down, we invited the homeless people to come out of the woods and out of the places where they were holed up, and we would feed them. The grocery store was nice enough to give us, as many hot dogs and hot dog buns as we wanted. So at night, that's what we would do. And we would provide a safe space for them to be for a short period of time. And I was fortunate enough to hear their stories. And the vast majority of them were because at the time, the state had closed down the state mental health hospitals and just dumped these people. They tried. I'm not gonna go as far as they just dumped them, but ultimately they just dumped them onto the streets because the resources to take care of them weren't there, and it rolled down onto the local police departments. So you go, the guy was arrested 42 times. Can you believe that? Yeah, these were the people that I was talking to who were going through the same problems. They didn't see police as their friend, as a helper. They saw the police as someone who was going to harass them, give them a hard time, push them somewhere else, let them be someone else's problem. And what you ended up with are people who were in the shadows, exploitable, abusable, and really desperate. And as I've said before, when there's desperation, when people feel desperate, they will do desperate things. And I remember at the time, I came out and I said, look, I believe this has a lot to do with the closures of the state hospital, the cutting of social safety net funding. Now, this is going back into the early 2000s. And I got a call from the governor's office, a Democrat. No, Rick, you're wrong. It's not the state hospitals. It's not the cuts in funding. We're doing all these wonderful things. For these folks, we're doing this wonderful stuff. And the Republican mayor called me, said, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. We're doing all these wonderful things. And I got this thought in my head, if both of them are calling me, if both of them are telling me, no, you're wrong, it can't possibly be, it made me go, I'm right. Because it was bipartisan that, no, we wouldn't do that. And yet, as we've cut these social safety net programs, as we've cut this help, what we've done is we've created more desperation. And I think back to one guy in particular that we met along the way, because look, it can happen to any of us. This was the other thing I came away with, that no matter where you are, what station in life you're at, any bad things can happen. And the reason that I believe so wholeheartedly in having a social safety net that's strong enough to help people in their hour of need is because of Joe. I met Joe, a Vietnam vet, lifelong conservative Republican, never missed a day of work, never collected unemployment, never needed anything from anyone until he got sick. Had a heart attack. And the job that he was working at, shuffling railroad engineers around, driving them from one place to another in a van, they had crummy health care. And, he was in the hospital with this heart attack. The bills are piling up. And he ends up not having income coming in because guess what? No paid sick leave. So he burns through his savings in no time whatsoever. And his landlord throws him out while he's still in the hospital, while he's still on the mend. Moves all of his stuff out onto the curb, and there's no one to stand up for Joe, no one to advocate for him, no state policies at the time, none of that stuff to help him. So and now he gets to the point where, hey, you can't go back to the job because you've been gone too long, you're out of luck. Now he's homeless, he's unemployable, and he's sick. The state picked up his health care bill because that's what we do through Medicaid, and good on us for doing that. We spent a couple $100,000 to keep Joe alive. And then we kicked him to the street, which is where we found Joe. Because one of the things that we did is when we would do these events, we would go and we'd get a bunch of cardboard boxes, a bunch of refrigerator boxes, and line them up under the trailer. And we would rent them out to people so that they could pretend to be homeless for a night. And for $20, you could play homeless on our Skid Row. And we would donate that money to the homeless shelter. And we gave one of the boxes to Joe. And he, as he said, the 10 days we were out in that parking lot were the safest that he had felt in months. Because he was sick, he was weak, and he was broke. And there was no help for him. And the help that we could get him took a long time to do. Now, when it ended, we ended up renting a hotel room for him for a bit until he could get into a VA center on the other side of the state. And then a couple of months later, he passed. But this is one of those moments where you start going, it could happen to you. It could happen to me. And I know we're told we're this grand religious nation. How can we allow that to happen? I couple that with the fact that there was a Bloomberg report out. An LA Times report out that said life expectancy in the U.S. has declined. And, they go through the reality. It has a lot to do with the fact that, guess what? Policy matters. Inequality matters. The place that has the lowest life expectancy in this country is not a surprise or should be a surprise to no one. It's the southeastern U.S. It's Alabama, it's Mississippi, it's Louisiana, it's Arkansas, it's those states, Tennessee, it's all of Georgia, it's those states. And not by a little bit, by a lot. And you go, well, it's just the South. Now, the pandemic had an awful lot to do with it. According to the CDC, COVID explains about half of the decline in life expectancy. But you have heart disease, you have chronic liver disease, you've got cirrhosis, you've got suicide, you've got opioid addiction, you've got all of these other problems. And policy tends to be what drives this. The states that have the lowest life expectancy, surprise, surprise. Many of them, eight of the 12 at the bottom, have not passed the Affordable Care Act, have not expanded Medicaid in their states. So are you surprised that people who aren't getting care are dying younger? No. So the question becomes, how do we as a civil society take crisis and take horrible situations like the death of this man and not use it for political fodder, but actually use it as a moment to go, a moment of self-reflection, to say that could be me, that could be you, that could be my brother or sister, that could be my neighbor, and make sure that it doesn't happen anymore. See, this is, again, my problem. The red hats and the blue hats are going after, hey, we're going to score on the other side. How do we fix this problem? How do we move forward and make sure that this doesn't happen again? Are you tired of think tank approved corporate news and commentary? Are you tired of CEOs telling you what to think, who to hate, and who to vote for? Well, welcome to the Rick Smith Show. We don't take orders from some boardroom, and we don't do focus groups or talking points. We don't work for them, and we never will. I'm Rick Smith, and I work for you. We are radio of, for, and by we the working people. Check out our program at thericksmithshow.com.
Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. I hope you'll join me on my new audio podcast, Justice Matters. I'll be using my 30 years as a federal prosecutor and Army JAG to unpack, break down, and explain the legal issues of the day, particularly where the legal intersects with the political. Please look for Justice Matters with Glenn Kirshner wherever you generally get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Chef Shanti, and today in the Organic Kitchen, I'm going to be showing you how to make my favorite breakfast burrito.
As a career wide receiver, I've been hit hard. But no training nor practice prepared us for the devastation of COVID-19. Thankfully, there is hope. Even with multiple vaccines available, we still have to work together until everyone is safe. We all win when we unite to prevent.
If you have not heard of the Sexy Liberal Podcasting Network, your podcasting superstation, you suck. I mean, we have the smartest, funniest liberals in the country. Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour. We have John Fugelsang. We have Hal Sparks, Frangela, Final Word, and Idiot of the Week. We have Bob Seska. Oh my God. We have Jody Hamilton from The Bunker. We have Start Me Up with Kimberly Johnson. We have Unprecedented. We have the smartest, funniest podcast, period. Get it now. SexyLiberal.com.
In this segment, Stephanie Miller and Malcolm Nance talk Trump's legal woes. There's a lot to talk about. Here's Stephanie.
Good morning, man. What a good morning. I can't take any more of this schadenfreude deliciousness. I mean, what's going to happen next? I mean, are we going to have 4 Republicans defect to the Democrats and throw the House? That's all we need once George Santos goes down.
Yeah. Oh my God. I know, Malcolm, besides being terrified at the prospect that Trump could ever get back into the Oval Office, I have to say, I guess it's good that the Republican Party largely tying themselves to him. Even after this, they're all, Tommy Tuberville said, this makes me want to vote for him twice. Marco Rubio, they all lined up, right? Lindsey Graham in support of Trump, which I guess they're going to do for the next 3 indictments too, right? For whether it's insurrection, sedition, espionage, you name it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you should be under no illusion that he is not going to be the nominee for president of the United States. There is no one that's going to challenge him. The only thing that I think could happen is maybe you have a couple of Republicans in the margins who are never Trumpers who can peel away some votes. But the Republicans are pushing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to do that against Biden. Yikes. But right now, what we're seeing is we are seeing the raw and utter corruption of the Republican Party come to the surface. It's not just George Santos, who is, I got to admit, everything you read to me, a moment ago, you think, of course he did that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, he's not going to be able to keep in wigs and Spanx for nothing. So a man's got expenditures.
A man's got to buy Spanx. Exactly.
Speaking of, and lots of highlighters.
Speaking of which, I loved your tweet. You said, right-wing fantasy of manhood is tactical gear King Leonidas' beard and an insanely expensive, highly modified AR-15 makes them Trump-appointed special operations soldiers ready to kill America's enemies. Those enemies are always other Americans. I mean, we were saying out here in Hollywood, Malcolm, this storyline is too obvious, that the guy, this last mass murderer, is a white supremacist with a swastika and an SS tattoo with right-wing death squad patch on his clothing, like Enrico Tarrio and some of the other January 6th terrorists, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I keep encouraging all of you to go to Substack, to the malcolmnance.substack.com and subscribe, because that's where I'm going to be doing a lot more of my talking. Twitter's having problems. Elon Musk is getting buggy, but I'm about to release this story in high detail. Mm-hmm. Why do these right-wing extremist gunmen all dress like U.S. Special Operations soldiers, only they're fat and out of shape? They wear the tactical equipment that you see in the movies. They have the body armor and an AR-15 that might be worth $800 with $4,000 worth of accessories to it. It's like, it's now, what we used to make a joke about, what we call the tactical tuxedo, right? This is what they're wearing now. It is almost a sign that you can identify a person by how they're going to come out of their house. Yeah. And we see these people parading in the streets. They were dressed like this on January 6th. They all think that they are some sort of, Meal Team 6, right? That they're these
I'm glad you got to that joke.
Yeah, I know, but they're these appointees by Trump. And ever since the war on terrorism has started, the look of the special operations soldier with the beard and the gun and the body armor, that's their game. They're live action role playing that they're people of importance. And they now feel that they have been empowered, deputized to kill by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
In today's Middle East, the issues are getting more complex and the noise is getting louder. It takes a lot more to really understand what's going on. Al Monitor has established itself as an independent and trusted pulse of the Middle East, providing angles that you won't see anywhere else. We have committed to hiring hundreds of the top journalists and experts from across the region to keep our audiences up to date on the latest news and the trends to watch for. Decision makers on foreign policy and international business, global media, and top regional authorities regularly read Al Monitor, making it a one-stop shop for gaining a better grasp of the Middle East. And now, with the launch of Al Monitor Pro, we're using our expert network and new datasets to offer premium, actionable insights to business and policy professionals around the world. Pro offers expert memos, data-driven trend reports, industry monitoring, and special events covering trade and investment, energy, technology, food security, and more to help analysts do their job better. Join our community as we continue to grow.
I'm Chef Shanti, and today we're going to make Cinnamon Toast Crunch French toast.
Republicans say they won't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. But can honest, hard-working middle-class Americans really believe what these politicians say? Republicans said they wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade. Here's what Supreme Court Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett said during their Senate confirmation hearings.
Roe v. Wade. It is a precedent of the United States Supreme Court. A good judge will consider it as precedent of the United States Supreme Court.
Roe v. Wade. It's settled as a precedent of the Supreme Court.
Roe is not a super precedent, but that doesn't mean that Roe should be overruled.
Well, we saw how that turned out. They played us for fools. Tell your elected officials to keep their hands off of our Social Security and healthcare benefits. Fool me once. Let Majority Rule was responsible for this message. LetMajorityRule.org is a project of the Marvin Lucas Super PAC, which is responsible for and paid for this ad and is not affiliated with or authorized by any political campaign or candidate or candidates committee.
In a subsequent interview with Fox News Digital, Trump said he planned to appeal the verdict while bashing the judge in the case as a Clinton administration appointee. We'll appeal. We got treated very badly by the Clinton appointed judge. The 9-member jury found that Trump did not commit rape of Carol in the mid-90s, but did find him liable for sexual abuse. He was ordered to pay Carol a total of $5 million. That's a lot of money, Maggie Dawn.
It is a lot of money, and what an interesting verdict it is. I actually took the time to go and download the verdict form so we would know exactly what questions the jury was asked to answer in the order in which they were asked to answer them, because I think jury forms are super interesting. So of course, the big headline, right, is that they did not find that Ms. Carroll proved by a preponderance of evidence that Donald Trump had raped her. Yet in the second question, that was the very first question on the jury form, and yet in the very second question of the jury form, they did find that Trump sexually abused Ms. Carroll. Well, what? I mean, it's just one of those interesting jury decisions, and oftentimes, now I wouldn't have naturally assumed this given that the jury was only out for a very relatively short period of time. Sometimes you'll see what you call these sort of split decision verdicts when juries have a really hard time coming to a unanimous decision. But here, given it only took a matter of a few hours, it certainly seems to indicate that they didn't have that much of a problem. Now, having said all that, you could see a situation in which these 9 people get in a room, and it was 6 men, 3 women. And there are, for a variety of, subconscious biases, reasons, etc., people just didn't have the votes to conclude that he raped her, but they all sort of agreed he did something terrible here. So that's how it's sorted out. And they awarded her $2 million for that wrongdoing alone. So on the sexual abuse alone, the award was $2 million. Then when you turn to the defamation, which is the sort of more sticky wicket of a legal concept, right? Purely legally, it's a harder thing to prove. And here, again, they found that, yes, he spoke falsely about her, that she was injured by that. And the total damages awarded by the jury here, and I think this is really interesting to note, exactly matches the amount of money that Miss Carroll's expert, which they called near the last day of full testimony in the trial, last Thursday, that expert testified that it would cost up to $2.7 million to repair Miss Carroll's reputation. That was her expert's testimony. And today in the verdict form, a total of exactly $2.7 million awarded to Miss Carroll in 2 different forms. We'll talk a little bit about that related to the defamation. So a very interesting verdict form and decision here.
I would have sought $1 billion to have my reputation repaired. Perhaps the persuadable jury would have followed my lead. The distinction I had seen in other reporting on the sexual battery but not rape is effectively perhaps the jury believed, as he essentially confessed, that he grabs women by the genitalia, but that is something different than the actual act of rape. They believe he did it because he confessed to it. Did he not, Maggie? That's the deposition we saw.
It would certainly defy all rationality and common sense for a man who says, I routinely sexually assault women. And by the way, that's what famous people can do, which he said in his deposition in this case, and went further to say that perhaps that was a fortunate thing that famous people can sexually assault women at will. Yes, it would seem to run counter to both the facts, common sense, and just all rationality to argue that he didn't sexually assault someone. Here, though, of course, they had to show up specifically that he assaulted by a preponderance of the evidence Miss Carroll on this day or dates, which in this case was very interesting. She couldn't recall even what year the assault had occurred. And I think when scholars and other court watchers look back, Miss Carroll's vehemence under a withering cross-examination of dubious merit by attorney Tacopina, as well as her very articulate way of explaining why she doesn't remember it as if a movie occurred, right? And we understand this from those that are experts in trauma, that isn't how the brain records traumatic events. So there are lots of very interesting tidbits from this trial to reflect upon. Again, our country's obsession with, was there intercourse is interesting to me. And I will take the jury to task for not concluding that Mr. Trump raped her. I don't see a world in which this man is in this circumstance, pulling up her skirt and pulling down her pantyhose, where he doesn't take that act to fruition, because that's not the kind of guy Donald Trump is. The only time I could see him not taking that act to fruition is if he had some mechanical problems. So I'm going to take the jury to task here on the finding that he did not rape her. But again, I think the amounts of in damages that are awarded here, as well as the clarity on the defamation piece, the jury sent a resounding message that this man sexually assaults women and he should be held to account and to pay for that.
Our fine guest, attorney Maggie Dawn. Maggie, my understanding, E. Jean Carroll retains the dress and there is DNA deposited on the dress she claims came from Donald Trump. This was not presented as evidence at this civil trial, my understanding. We know Trump's going to appeal. You talked about the rape verdict was not found as you think it should have been found. Does the lack of any sort of, direct witness testimony or even DNA evidence presented at civil trial, do you think that's the reason or a possible reason why the rape charge did not stick like the other two allegations did?
I'm not going to speculate. Listen, I can speak generally to the fact that the CSI effect, the law and order effect, has had a significantly material and negative impact on what jurors now expect when they sit in courtrooms. In the vast majority of violent crimes, we do not have DNA or any sort of scientific evidence. In the vast majority of sexual assault, I shouldn't say the vast majority, in a significant proportion of sexual assaults and rapes, there is no DNA evidence. There is a goodly amount that do have that, but the absence thereof, I think, is overweighted by juries, all else being equal. I can't speculate as to what might be in effect here. I could say that that is just as likely, in my opinion, as it may be that a jury felt some trepidation over calling a former American president a rapist as a legal matter. And again, I'm going to take them to task for that. I just don't understand it. And I cannot foresee a set of facts where Donald Trump is sexually assaulting them, and if he has the power and ability to do so, where he does not rape a woman under those facts that Ms. Carroll testified to here. But again, I think this is all part and parcel, and we can look at that as part of this very negative CSI and law and order effect that we've seen throughout our legal system.
Maggie Dawn, Council, our fine guest. Thank you, Maggie. Great to see you again. And I'm with you on that with the jury. I mean, it's hard for me to comprehend how the jury could, hear this testimony and understand it and comprehend what was going on. But then the same circumstances, they're not able to, while they're fine with accepting the sexual battery or the sexual assault, it's just too much to go to the rape. And perhaps, as mentioned, the American president might have had something to it. Maybe it was, as Crudy mentioned, this constant conversation of Trump admitting over and over again that, for the last million years, if you're a star, you can grab them by the genitalia, and that's totally fine. We're not in the jury room. We're here talking about it on the radio. Let's talk about Trump's reaction. Of course, Trump, all caps, tweeted, "We'll let that lie." His attorney was out today, though. He did talk about appealing. He talked about court bias. He said that the Access Hollywood tape should never have been admitted. And he talked about the motions that they laid out during the course of the trial that would help them perhaps in appeal. Maggie Dawn, your opinion on any of those issues?
Well, that's what they've got to say, right? I mean, let's just observe the obvious. First of all, every lawyer, when you lose a case, will come out, especially if it's one that is it has a lot of public attention. You'll say, we're going to review the trial court's rulings very carefully, and we think there were substantial errors and my client didn't get a fair trial, and so we're going to appeal. That is just part and parcel of what lawyers do. Nothing to see there. As to whether or not the Access Hollywood tape was to be admitted as evidence, really interesting question that I think it was a pretty savvy decision from the trial judge's standpoint, because indisputably everyone on that jury had heard about it. And so at least this way, they weren't talking, trying to avoid talking about the thing that everyone already knew. Oh, and also he effectively admitted the same thing in his deposition, right? He was confronted with it. He admitted the same thing in his deposition. So on balance, I think an appeals court would have a really hard time concluding that single piece of evidence was so prejudicial that without it, no jury could ever have come to the conclusion that this one did, which is generally the standard on appeal, where you don't have ineffective assistance of counsel and some other appeal grounds, is basically, was the evidentiary error, in other words, allowing or disallowing evidence made by the trial judge, so egregious, so out of bounds that the absence or presence of that piece of evidence would have changed the outcome. I just don't think that argument holds any sort of water here. And if you can't get a fair trial on something like this in New York, I don't know where you can get it.
When we come back, Thom's final take.
As a career wide receiver, I've been hit hard. But no training nor practice prepared us for the devastation of COVID-19. Thankfully, there is hope. Even with multiple vaccines available, we still have to work together until everyone is safe. We all win when we unite to prevent.
I'm Chef Shanti, and today we're gonna make Cinnamon Toast Crunch French toast.
If you have not heard of the Sexy Liberal Podcasting Network, your podcasting superstation, you suck. I mean, it is we have the smartest, funniest liberals in the country. Stephanie Miller's Happy Hour. We have John Fugelsang. We have Hal Sparks, Frangela, Final Word and Idiot of the Week. We have Bob Seska. Oh my God. We have Jody Hamilton from The Bunker. We have Start Me Up with Kimberly Johnson. We have Unprecedented. We have the smartest, funniest podcast, period. Get it now. SexyLiberal.com.
Just touching on topics you and the representative spoke about and your comments about the CNN town hall. We have a media that just follows the latest shiny object time after time and gives us false equivalencies, so that we're now in a situation where our president is being blamed for this debt ceiling crisis that he didn't make. I remember 2011 and how President Obama blinked to the Republicans, and we ended up with that sequester rule. I'm just thinking, why aren't we looking at a return to a fairness doctrine of some kind for broadcast media, which is the only media, and that would have to include social media, which feeds off it, which is basically what everybody in this country who is trying to keep a family fed and clothed and housed is listening to.
Yeah. Number one, a fairness doctrine would not solve the problem that you're identifying, Susan, or at least the fairness doctrine that we used to have. We used to have balance in our media, not because of the fairness doctrine, but because most radio and television stations in the country were locally owned. That changed in 1996 when Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act. And now you've got, giant, massive conglomerates that are owned by right-wing billionaires and very conservative corporations that, own the media. Sinclair Broadcasting with over 200 television stations. What used to be Comcast, what used to be Clear Channel, and I'm forgetting, Cumulus was the other network that each have, roughly 1,000 radio stations. Frankly, the way to bring diversity back to our media is to start enforcing the antitrust laws again, is to, reverse that part of the Telecommunications Act so that, local newspapers, local radio stations, local television stations are returned to local control. It used to be that you couldn't own, out-of-state radio stations and television stations. You had to live in state. You couldn't own more than a certain number of them. You couldn't have cross-ownership, a radio station and a television station and a newspaper. And there were a few exceptions to that, but by and large, that was the case. And the result of that was, and I worked in this field back, my first real job as a teenager when I was 16 was as a country western DJ at WITL in Lansing, Michigan. And then later I was, I helped produce a talk show that, on that station, the Chuck Drake Show. So it wasn't the fairness doctrine that did it. The fairness doctrine only applied to station management or ownership, actually. So if they did an editorial on the air, there had to be a rebuttal. But it didn't apply to the talent. It didn't apply to the people on the air. So I share your concern, but that's what we need to be focusing on, Susan, is breaking up these giant media conglomerates. Make sense?
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate your clarification.
Okay. Thanks a lot,
Thank
Susan. Good talking to you.
Bye.
In fact, I used to, I was involved in finding people to rebut. We actually used to do editorials. I worked also at a TV station, WJIM TV in Lansing, Michigan. And the family that owned WJIM, the owner of the station, it was just a local family. They would come on and do editorials, and Thom Jones and I had to, that was his name, had to find, a local person to rebut the editorial because the fairness doctrine called for that. But that was it, just the editorials from the station ownership.
That's going to do it for RFL today. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again tomorrow. Till then.